Good afternoon, everybody. Thank you so much for coming to today's webinar, Resilient Leadership, Tools for Elected Officials and Executive Leaders. We are very excited to have you all here. We've got a really great program ahead of us. I will not take up too much of our time, I promise. So to get us started, I am McKenna Sturgeon. I am the Colorado Municipal League's Training and Marketing Specialist. I am joined today with the Colorado Resiliency Office and CCI in partnership for this webinar. Thank you very much for doing that with us. We're excited to have you. So today we're going to be talking about how to be prepared for disasters. We've got a huge panel. We're really excited to have everyone here. So before we get started on talking with them, I do want to give everyone who's new to GoToWebinar a quick rundown. To the right of your screen, you should have a panel. That is where you can go ahead and ask questions. There should be a drop down that says questions in it. You can go ahead and type your question there, and then we will be asking those for you at the end of the presentation. That just makes it a little bit easier for us to read through and make sure that we get everything answered. In addition to that, we will be sending out a link to the recording and the presentation materials from today's presentation after the webinar. You can feel free to follow up with any other questions on that email. Also feel free to send that link to anyone who might find it helpful. With that, I will turn it over to Shale with the Colorado Resiliency Office.
Great, thank you so much, McKenna. If you don't mind going to the next slide, please. Awesome. So yes, my name is Shale Sabo. I'm with the Colorado Resiliency Office as the Resiliency Program Manager, and I am very excited to be able to partner with CCI and CML as well as FEMA to bring you all this leadership series. Next slide, please. So I'm going to kick us off by talking about what the state can support when it comes to resiliency and recovery efforts and how we can help support local governments and community partners. And I just wanted to kind of start us off by kind of grounding us in the current situation that we're in and why this is an important and timely conversation to be having. So Colorado continues to see impacts from major disasters. If we think back to 2020, we saw 3 of our largest fires just in the last 2 years alone, with the Cameron Peak fire even lasting 4 months through the winter, even following a snowstorm that brought 2 feet of snow. And then we saw the Marshall Fire in Boulder County, which began New Year's Eve and was in a time period outside of what we think of as a normal fire season. Also, current projections actually do predict that this could be another historical year for wildfires, if not the worst yet, due to current conditions. We have seen some relief through the recent moisture we have gotten, but it's something to keep in mind that that could very well change. And situations in addition to wildfire impacts, we continue to see increased stressors in Colorado. So we see water impacts, drought conditions throughout the state, more pressure on existing water systems and sources, as well as such things as population growth and density. We saw major supply chain disruptions through events like the pandemic, many of which are still experiencing some disruptions and have not yet fully recovered or have changed completely. And additionally, our changing environment is prevalent. So we see increased frequency and intensity of natural disasters, so looking at things like storms or other types of natural hazards, as well as the fact that in a post-wildfire situation where we saw extreme heat and extreme conditions, that changes the environment physically, and we see cascading impacts such as post-fire flooding or difficulty returning to normal states of vegetation. And that has impacts in and of itself. Next slide, please. So what we want to really stress for you all is that you don't have to go through recovery alone. We are here as the CRO, the Colorado Resiliency Office, as well as many of our state partners with whom we work with pretty frequently. And in everything we do, we take a holistic approach and look to support one another through interagency efforts. We are here to support the recovery for the long term. Of course, it depends on the type of disaster. For most major disasters, we will be there to support you through the duration of the incident. So oftentimes we hear such things as recovery begins at the time of the disaster. And what we mean by that is that it should be something that we look at planning wise and being proactive at the time an event starts. in that we should be looking at what we can think of that could happen through recovery at that time and being ready for it. However, I would also argue that recovery is a proactive process and is really a resiliency planning effort. And so by being proactive and using recovery planning at the time of a preparedness effort is also really vital, as it can help ensure recovery time is shorter and more efficient when moving through an incident. So I wanted to talk a little bit quickly about the role of the Colorado Resiliency Office and how we support long-term recovery efforts, as well as the other phases of the disaster cycle. So the CRO was established with the intention of creating a body that leads Colorado forward in creating a root culture of resilience. So we have been charged with providing information, resources, technical expertise, and support to Colorado entities in fostering resiliency efforts. So one of the ways that we've done this is by developing the Colorado Resiliency Framework, which many of you might be familiar with. And this was developed as a sort of guiding document for the state of Colorado to support institutionalizing resilience. So again, getting to that root culture of resiliency. And furthermore, this identifies strategies and solutions for many of the challenges and stressors our state continues to face when it comes to resiliency efforts and long-term planning. And then the CRO also supports local governments in the development of their own resiliency frameworks or other types of similar efforts. So we're really here to be a resource hub and a guiding body for you all. The CRO is housed in the Department of Local Affairs and works very closely with the Division of Local Government. And so the way that the Division of Local Government helps to support recovery especially is in the form of the support of regional field managers, as well as funding opportunities, community development support, and technical assistance, among many other types of services. And just speaking really quickly to the role of recovery managers, they can be thought of as connection points to more state resources and additional information. And oftentimes, many of them have also worked in local government and have been in your shoes and can help guide you through different types of issues or challenges you may be experiencing, whether it comes to disaster management or the long-term recovery cycle. So regional field managers also help to support continuity of government after a disruption, as well as such things as setting up disaster assistance centers, which you'll hear more about, and rebuilding efforts following a disaster. And then just kind of reiterating that we work as a team approach. So shortly you will be hearing from our partners at the Department of Homeland Security and Emergency Management. And we also partner often with local governments and help to walk through things in a network type of a way. I also wanted to let you all know that we have a lot of resources for resiliency and recovery available on our website, which is at coresiliency.com. And following this presentation, as McKenna mentioned, we will have a takeaway document that has many of the links to these. So we have tools such as the pre-disaster and resiliency toolkits, as well as peer-to-peer support and peer exchanges. We have documents such as the Planning for Hazards Land Use Solutions Guide that can be used to look at recovery planning from a land use perspective, which Dale will speak to shortly, and our recovery toolkit. Next slide. And with that, I will go ahead and turn it over to Mike and Jim from DHSEM.
All right, thanks, Shale. Appreciate it, and appreciate everyone's time today on this really important topic. I think I'd like to start by reiterating something Shale mentioned, and that is that recovery really starts in the preparedness phase. It starts before an incident ever happens. And so it's really important for local jurisdictions and communities to start getting their arms around how they would recover before they ever have to. We're going to talk a little bit about some of the plans that the Division of Homeland Security and Emergency Management helps with. The first one on that list is a hazard mitigation plan. That's a really important plan as you look at what are the threats and hazards that your communities face. What are the things you can do to reduce the impact should those threats or hazards manifest themselves? It's also important fiscally. That's a plan that should you have the unfortunate experience of a Stafford Act declaration, a major declaration from the federal government. In order to qualify for post-disaster mitigation dollars, you have to have an approved hazard mitigation plan. And so our team will work with you to make sure that your plan is current and that it truly addresses the threats and hazards that you face. The next one on that list is the emergency operations plan. A lot of times, I think there's a tendency to just push that off onto your local emergency manager. I think Lori Hodges could attest to that happening. But really, we encourage you to work with all your stakeholders as you prepare your emergency operations plan for your local government. We do that here at the state. And then the last one on that list, I think, is a relatively new program. We started it about 3 years ago, and it's the Colorado Emergency Preparedness Assessment, where our team helps your jurisdiction go through the 32 core capabilities for response, recovery, mitigation to threats and hazards. It's really been, we've done 35 counties now, and it's been a really successful program where counties really get to know themselves better than they have before. It brings together a whole bunch of stakeholders, sometimes ones that you didn't think of, to get together in a room and work through how prepared you are. One of the things I'll emphasize about the CEPA is it's not a grade. It's simply an assessment, and it's your assessment of where you stand in your preparedness to respond to and recover from an incident or a disaster. I'll go through really quickly the roles. We have 10 regional field managers that are out in service areas throughout the entire state. They know all of your emergency managers and often know your county administrators as well. So they're good people to know. And as an incident begins to unfold in your jurisdiction, they'll be the first contact from the Office of Emergency Management. Our mitigation team has both a plans technical assistance section and then a projects technical assistance to help you both complete a good solid hazard mitigation plan, but also prepare for submitting mitigation grant applications and hopefully having successful ones. I'm going to pass a little bit on recovery because Jim Raymond's going to speak a little bit more in depth as he's our state recovery officer. The integrated preparedness, you may have known them previously as the training and exercise section, but we've really moved towards a far more comprehensive approach to preparedness than just training and exercises, and including helping local jurisdictions understand, do they have the right plans? Are they organized correctly? Do they have the equipment that they need? And then the training and the exercise components of rehearsing for a disaster. Our response section runs the state's Emergency Operations Center. And so as incidents unfold, we can build capacity in the Operations Center. It's also, I always remind people, that's not the Division of Homeland Security Emergency Management's Operations Center. It's the State Emergency Operations Center. And so emergency response coordinators from all the different state agencies participate in the State Emergency Operations Center during an activation. We're currently activated today in support of the highly pathogenic avian influenza, and obviously partnering very closely with our partners in the Colorado Department of Agriculture. Our plan section, where you'll encounter them mostly, is they actually execute the Colorado Emergency Preparedness Assessment Program. And so our plans folks work very closely with stakeholders in your jurisdictions to do that assessment. Kind of touched on some of these tools already. The Colorado Emergency Preparedness Assessment goes through, and that POETI is the plans, organization, equipment, training, and exercise model that we'll use to help jurisdictions prepare an integrated preparedness plan. The elected officials guide is published and updated about every other year. We just finished one up, and you can get those from our regional field managers. And then during a federally declared disaster, we operate a joint field office to integrate all the different capacities that FEMA brings and other federal agencies such as U.S. Department of Agriculture and recently the Health and Human Services. So next slide, please. What I'm going to do now is turn it over to Jim. Jim is our state recovery officer. He's got a team of 5 folks that work both planning for recovery but also assisting jurisdictions as they go through the process of recovery. So, Jim?
Okay, thanks, Director Willis. And I want to echo just thanks for everybody having time to really take part in getting educated and continuing this really important conversation. Emergency management is typically divided up into 5 phases, with recovery being one of them. But it's really a circle and the whole point of what we really want to try to do in recovery is create that sense of stability and normalcy and come back a little bit better from a disaster. One of the things that I hear when I travel across the state from local officials, especially in all areas of the state and in other states too, is, I didn't realize how many people it would take. I didn't realize how much money it would cost or how complicated it would be. I hear a lot of very professional administrators still talk about being surprised at how complicated some of the recovery is. It really ends up being visible and complicated from a standpoint of really taking a lot of people and making a lot of decisions. And there are some toolkits that we have that really try to boil that down to just some basic 10 steps that emergency managers and local jurisdictions can take, because really recovery is it's a team sport, to be sure, and not just of a couple of folks. It really takes a whole community effort. When we recover from any disaster, and you can see on the slide, really since 2018, we've been involved in 30 state emergencies. And so those are, state disasters, declaration of emergency, and numerous extended emergencies, too many to even mention. And really what we try to do in recovery is really set those conditions for recovery so that this team that I was talking about can really provide a great sense of recovery for your community. We look to the, local officials, state officials, federal officials, but it also very much extends to our not-for-profit, our voluntary agencies, and our private sector. So it's pretty fair to say that no one person or no one agency is going to complete the recovery for your community in right after a disaster. It's because it's not an organization that we're used to running. It's a new organization that we have to stand up to make a lot of important decisions very quickly, and it requires a lot of new partners. And so sometimes there's a lot of tension around that, and the need to be very professional. So the way that we're organized in the state, you can see Director Willis talked a little bit about our the different planning tools that we have that we use. The State Emergency Operations Center is, as you mentioned, the state's center, and really that's where we can bring together this all this new information and try to provide some solutions. Underneath that nests the State Recovery Task Force. The last thing I'll talk about is really just how that State Recovery Task Force reaches out to all the different state agencies. And I can't think of a state department or executive agency that doesn't have a recovery role. And so to be able to facilitate that communication and coordination is really critical. And it's not perfect because disasters tend to be a little messy, but one of the ways that's commonly used to organize some of the different topics in recovery, the functions of recovery, are through these recovery support functions. And there's 5 of them that we look to in Colorado, where we try to bring major solutions to communities, partner with the communities, and really all of the state agencies really come together in a highly coordinated fashion as best that we can to try to help every unique situation. I think the last thing too that's been my very true to the experiences that I've seen is how every disaster is really different. And so when we look at a wildland fire or a flood in one area, the conditions and environment for that disaster really change from place to place and year to year. And so we really try to build those lessons from what we've seen before, but then try to pull together the new circumstances around that disaster. So that's really what I have to share for our limited time together. Want to thank everybody for being a part of this, and certainly for the CRO for pulling this together for CML. So I'll turn that back over to Lori.
Great, thanks, Jim. We'll move on to Lori from Larimer County.
At first, I thought those slides were all different, and I was like, oh. So you go back one. Is there one before this one? Or is that? Okay, so yes, I'm Lori Hodges. I'm the Emergency Management Director for Larimer County. And I worked at both the local and the state levels. And when I meet with executives and elected officials, one of the questions I get the most is, or not really a question, but one of the concerns I get the most is they just don't know where to start. You know, there's so much that could be done. What really are those key things? If I only needed to do just a couple things, what would that be so that I could be better prepared? So that's what I'm doing today, is I'm going to give you 5 quick lessons in how you can prepare for recovery. So those top 5 recommendations, the first one is to establish a legal basis for emergency management. I'm going to go over what that means and why this is so important. This goes hand in hand with developing clear lines of authority for emergency management and specifically recovery. In a lot of emergency management organizations, recovery is not part of the emergency management program. It's completely separate, or it's in a different department. So you need to make sure those connections are made. Agreements between jurisdictions, what agreements are important? How do you get those agreements? What currently exists? I'll go over those. And then I'll talk about a disaster policy or disaster waivers, which is how you change your policy from day-to-day operations to a disaster. And finally, procurement rules. I think FEMA will be very happy with me for saying that procurement is something you really definitely need to look at prior to a disaster, because once you're in the disaster, it's really too late to try to figure out what those rules look like. So if you go to the next slide. The first one that I mentioned, I really think if I was going to give anybody any kind of recommendation, it would be start at your foundation. So do you even know what the legal basis is for emergency management within your jurisdiction, whether it's city, county, special district, or otherwise? And what does that look like? What does the statute say? And then what does your charter or your code say? When I first started with Larimer County, the very first thing I did was I looked at our county code. And I looked at our legal documents that described emergency management and gave us the authority to do our job. And then we revised those documents. Many people do not have a legal basis established within their codes or in any resolution or otherwise. This can be a really big problem when you're trying to work through recovery and you're trying to get reimbursements and you don't have the authority to do that work. This also leads to clear lines of authority for various different tasks. So when I talk about this, I'm really talking about me as the director of emergency management. What do I have the authority for with spending? What do I have the authority for resource management? How are those authorities given to me? So as an elected or a key official, you definitely want to give your emergency manager or whoever is in charge of the emergency operations center and ordering equipment, you want to give them explicit written authority that tells them that they can do this, and whatever that authority looks like, if there's a dollar threshold or if you can only work with certain agencies, but try to make that as broad as you can within your legal structure so that they don't run into any kind of barriers. So go ahead to the next slide really quick. In Larimer County, we do have an emergency management resolution that establishes myself as the director. We have a resolution that establishes the department and what all we can do and what our authorities are. And then we also have written in our county code what we're able to do. An additional feature that we created was a disaster policy. The disaster policy we came up with after the 2013 flood, where we realized we had a lot of problems with current authorities and policies that didn't really fit the disaster. For example, we didn't have a debris plan during the 2013 flood. FEMA, when we were doing debris operations, they wanted to look at what our policy was for debris. Well, the only thing that we had that was somewhat similar was a rubbish code. Well, as you can imagine, rubbish is a very different thing than debris. We fine people for rubbish if it's on their property and they don't do something about it. So we ended up having to send letters to folks saying, following our policy for the rubbish policy in order to try to get reimbursed for debris. And that is just a recipe for disaster. So what we did was we created this disaster policy, which outlines how all of our local policies, day-to-day policies change in the event of a disaster. So we don't use our rubbish code, we use our debris plan for disaster now that we have a debris plan. but it does state in the disaster policy that the Board of Commissioners can waive any and all fees in the event of a disaster to help the recovery move forward. That's a key piece that you guys should be thinking about. It increases the purchasing threshold. So instead of our normal day-to-day thresholds, which don't have to be as high, we definitely need to increase those purchasing thresholds to be able to move resources into an area. So we increase those to match the federal thresholds because they were the most restrictive of the local, state, and federal thresholds, which is what FEMA is going to look at. Which of those thresholds is the most restrictive? So we didn't want to be our own barrier. So we changed those thresholds that when we locally declare a disaster, our purchase thresholds are changed and we outline what that is in the policy. And then we also have a provision, not everybody's going to like this, but we do have a provision for payment of employees. So we pay exempt employees overtime if we're on a disaster for 2 weeks or more, a local disaster, again, not a FEMA disaster. None of this can be dependent upon FEMA. That's another thing that you should have in your policies. You shouldn't say, if we get FEMA funding or if we get a FEMA declaration, we're going to change this. It has to be based on your local declarations and local policies. Go ahead to the next slide, please. So agreements and contracts for this one, you can get what's the word I'm looking for? You can get tripped up if you don't have the right agreements in place. So at a bare minimum, a really good agreement is how you share and order resources. This could be people and this could be supplies. So how do you move between different jurisdictions, resources, and orders? The state has a statewide IGA for emergency management, which allows any county that's signed on to move resources between counties. Well, we did the same thing within Larimer County. Every jurisdiction within Larimer County, whether they're a special district, municipality, or county, has all signed on to this so that fire districts can share resources between each other. We can share resources. I can bring people into my emergency operations center and they can order resources for us. So again, if you don't have that agreement in place and you're looking for some kind of reimbursement, it could become a tripping hazard for you if you don't have it written down. Also, EOC authorities, I did hear from one jurisdiction that they didn't have it written down what their authorities were to do in an emergency operations center, and therefore they did get some hangups there as well, where FEMA came back and said that something may or may not be eligible because they didn't have the authority to order that resource. So just keep that in mind when you're doing your agreements. We do have all kinds of examples that we can share with you. I did send Shale the disaster policy. I don't know if they're sharing any kind of documents after this, but that's definitely available if anybody would like that. And then contracts, this is really important as well. We have a number of $0 on-call contracts in Larimer County. We did not have them for the flood. And that became, again, a barrier for us to be able to move quickly and to try to recover quickly. Some examples of $0 on-call contracts. When I say $0 on-call, what I'm talking about is a contract that doesn't cost you anything until you use it. So we're not paying all the time for this contract. So there's really no downside to this other than you have to do an RFP every 5 years and then update it every year, whatever that is. So debris operations is key. I hear from folks all the time saying, oh, we're not going to do debris. And I'm just here to tell you, you are going to do debris at some point in a disaster. Even if you don't want to, debris can become such a big deal that you're going to have to step in. And when you do step in, you're going to have contracts for both debris monitoring and debris operations. Well, getting those contracts in place ahead of time allows you to quickly move those debris operators in within 24 hours, and they can just start the process of moving debris. We have in Larimer County multiple debris contracts, but we also have an overall recovery contract. That covers us for the debris monitoring, but also covers us for anything else recovery related. So during COVID, we needed to do a COVID plan. They were able to help us with a COVID plan. They help us with public assistance. So all of the FEMA stuff, the rules change all the time. They're experts in all of that. They can provide me that direct assistance. If we ever have to have meetings with our community or elected officials and it's about something specific, technical, they can help with that as well. So those are just 2 on-call contracts. We also have catering contracts that we use during response. And we have contracts to get a base camp or supplies that we would need to set up an incident management team. And the reason we have those 2 is because we activate all the time and we have wildfires all the time. So we've learned that we definitely need to be able to have catering contracts in place so that we don't run into any kind of procurement problems. Procurement rules, this again, everything I'm talking about is regarding resources, right? So what are your current procurement rules, and are there any barriers within those rules that are going to keep you from being able to access resources that you're going to need during a disaster? The procurement rules tend to change, so you really need somebody in your organization who's looking at this and who knows what those rules are pre-disaster. And when you do any contract in your jurisdiction, there should be provisions in that contract. If there's any reason why you would use that contract for disasters, you should have in an appendix that has all that federal language about FEMA programs, the HUD programs, so the Community Development Block Grant programs have different rules for Davis-Bacon. If you have that attachment in there and it's part of that contract, then you may be able to use that contract when you have a disaster. So those are just a couple of key tips there. There's a ton on procurement. That could be a whole hour. I won't go into all of that, but just know that the procurement rules are very important pre-disaster to know what they are, to make sure you know what your thresholds are, and then to be able to move into the disaster once it happens. Next slide. All right, well, I guess I don't have my last slide. So I guess that's it. So thank you guys for having me. And if there's questions, I will take those, I guess, at the end. Thank you.
All right, thank you, Lori. And we'll go ahead and turn it over to Dale Case from Boulder County, who will give us recovery perspectives from a land use perspective.
Yeah, thank you, Shale. Thanks, everyone. And yeah, I echo, I appreciate everybody taking the time today to be here and listening. And I know I always learn things, so it's always great to be part of a panel too, learn some new things. So I'm going to talk a little bit about that preparedness for recovery from a planning and land use perspective, and give you a little bit of what we've done in Boulder County as far as that. So next slide, please. Just some thinking about it is we know these things are going to happen, right? And it's obvious to a lot of folks, especially in the emergency management office, but often not to the public. And the disasters, right now we're talking a lot about fire, but we have to also be thinking about anything else that might be coming our way as well from both the planning, from a planning standpoint, land use standpoint. And so always trying to get out there, working with the public, talking about things, doing planning helps raise awareness. So just the process itself, there's value to it so that people understand that that little creek that is sitting there in that top picture can turn into a raging river washing out houses down the way. So next slide, please. There's just great value in planning. Again, disasters, we've got all kinds around here, and we unfortunately keep seeing them more and more. Next slide. And just some other reasoning for planning and why it's important and why it's never too late is after the floods in 2013, the first person I think that got up and spoke at our planning commission as we were looking at how we're going to rebuild, talked about how they bought a house on a beautiful little ditch and thought everything was fine, but their quote was that we should never let them build there. The house was built in 1974. We didn't have regulations back then that dealt with this, but it was up to somebody that felt very strongly that the county should have been doing something, and we do those things now, and we continue to grow and learn to do those things. Next slide, please. And again, just the sheer magnitude of what we're seeing. Lori, with the Cameron Peak fire, and East Troublesome fire, it's happening, and we're seeing it continue to happen. When you overlay the Cameron Peak fire on top of Boulder County, which we do have a slide, it goes all the way from one end of our county to the other. So something that hits that size would just devastate Boulder County. So that preparedness and ability to recover is super important. Next slide, please. So what do we do when we do planning? We're looking at, first, I think, and foremost, how to avoid damage and destruction. So when we look at things, we work really hard to try to find ways to avoid the hazards as much as we can. And there's certain hazards we're not going to be able to predict where they're going to happen or what's going to happen. So that's hard. Next, we look at how do we mitigate and protect? How do we prepare our staff for both the response and the recovery? As we've heard, I think you heard earlier, that recovery starts at response, or it actually starts much earlier. Recovery starts now. We're planning for our next disasters, and we're looking at what we need to do to our codes, our comp plans, our programs to be able to recover quicker and get people back in a smoother way whenever something happens. And that takes a lot of work as we move forward. And I think, as Lori said, form those relationships. Disasters don't know jurisdictional boundaries. And so you have to have those relationships with staffs and with some elected officials, and even with the public in those other jurisdictions, so that you've got those relationships, because that public piece of it is really important to being able to move forward to recovery in a way that is less challenging. Next slide. And it takes coordination through the planning efforts. When we started looking at this after the flood, really, of all the different pieces of planning that people were looking at, and this is just a small subset of plans that deal with hazard mitigation, natural hazards, climate change, all those parts, our wildfire, community wildfire protection plans, all those pieces, talking amongst all these groups and trying to come up with a coordinated approach. It is difficult, it takes time, and sometimes it's not first thing on our email box that we feel we have to deal with that day. So again, by being here doing this, you're carving out the time, you're recognizing the importance of being proactive. And I think that is the most important thing, is making space for yourself, for staffs to be able to plan and do this work as we move forward. Next slide, please. And all the different plans will inform each other, hopefully. And you're not going to have just one huge plan that's going to be able to cover everything. And again, we have different jurisdictions that are going to cover things. And so having that ability to recognize those interactions, those relationships, taking the time to go through those plans to understand what they contain, where there might be some synergy between them, some ability to plan programs together with the other jurisdictions is really important as we move forward on these things too. Next slide. So just in Boulder County, we've got and have had a really strong natural hazards element to our comp plan that recognizes the hazards in the county and has some really strong policy language that helps us be able to develop programs and regulations to address that. Start with some very sort of specific policies that are broader, but the idea that some direction and some things that we put out there when we do publications or when we're talking to groups about what we're trying to accomplish and why it's important. Next slide. The slide digs a little bit more into some of those policies and the natural hazards element. Again, we don't want to have activities, land use changes that would aggravate, accelerate, or increase the level of risk. We should reduce the level of risk through positive county action by guiding development away from areas that are prone to natural disturbances. And so again, strong policy language in our comp plan helps us be able to develop those programs and the code language to implement that. Next slide. And then we have specific policies in our plan that will deal with the different types of hazards out there. So flooding, fire, wildfire, erosion. And these are, again, things then more specific of what we're going to be looking at as far as what we might require when we're doing land use reviews, or what might be required or in a referral to a city when we're looking at their annexation and subdivision plans, providing them with information from our tools and our database as far as how to move forward or what concerns that they should be aware of. So helping that communication piece of it, helping plan for those regulations. Next slide, please. And then we have some goals in our comp plan also that are really important, I think, and really helped as we've gone through our disasters. And one of the sort of cornerstones of Boulder County is we don't approve development in the unincorporated part of the county, really. That is left through the comprehensive plan to happen in and adjacent to the existing cities. And that policy has allowed us to not have subdivisions in some of these hazard areas. We have not approved a subdivision in the mountains since 1972. So we haven't created new lots up in the mountains in that zone 1, wildfire hazard zone 1, in a long time. And so, but we still have a lot of development up there and a lot of vacant lots that can still be built, but we're not creating more development in that specific interface zone, and especially in sort of that sprawled kind of manner as it moves forward. And I think that has helped in the events that have happened to reduce some of the impacts that we've seen in the past. Next slide, please. Oops, next slide, please. Weird one. And just having the technical information. So doing your mapping and doing the science behind it helps you be able to tell the story to everyone who's making the decisions, to the public, and to make real solid decisions based on that. So working to prepare all that, use the maps to help guide decision making as it moves forward, and the science is an extremely important piece of it. Next slide. So what do we do then? We've got our sort of the tools and integration piece of it. We've got our overarching comp plan policies, and we can do things through regulation and programmatic. And so I'll cover a few of these here. And I've kind of modified this presentation a little bit from the past, so I won't cover all these. Promise I won't bore you that long. But next slide, please. So what I call the regulations, the hammer side of things, of telling people what needs to be done. So we've got our floodplain regulations. We've done remapping after the floods based on updated science and updated mapping. So again, really helping explain the risk to people. We've got our site plan review process. You've got your building codes where you can do things. We've got a transfer development credits program, which deals a little bit with disasters, and our Article 19, which we call our post-disaster regulations. Next slide. So in our code, we have specific criteria that when we're doing a review of a development, that you have to address the hazard risks, the natural hazards in any development that happens. So you can adopt specific code criteria where every time you look at something, that developer has to address the concern and make sure that we're developing in the safest manner possible, or avoiding areas whenever possible again. Next slide, please. In 1993, we developed a site plan review process in Boulder County to deal with development, at first specifically up in the mountains in the real hazard zones. And this was a result of the 1988 Black Tiger fire, and really trying to be more resilient back then in construction and requiring wildfire mitigation and defensible space back then. And when we look at sort of some of the numbers from our fires that we've had, the homes that have gone through this process and have been mitigated have been better protected during those events. So some good results there. Next slide, please. And then what we did after the 4 Mile Canyon fire in 2010 is we wanted to be out in front. We realized we needed to be out in front of planning for the disaster before it happens. We were caught pretty flat-footed from a recovery standpoint. During that fire, we went to public meetings right away, and you get asked questions of what you're going to do, what it's going to be to rebuilding, and got my planners, I've got public officials, and everybody's saying kind of different things. And so starting to really frame it ahead of time is really important, because it's really hard to reel back things that are said in those meetings. And so having set standards, set materials in place ahead of time has been super helpful. But we also have to do a good job of keeping staff, because we've had a good churn in staff, up to date on these regulations and the changes in the public officials, other department heads, elected officials, planning commission, any of those folks, keeping them in the loop and training constantly on this, so that as they change, they're aware of what's in place as you move forward. Because once you're in the disaster, as I think you've heard, there's so many decisions that have to get made. If you've got some decisions that are already made, and especially if they're hard decisions about fees or about being able to rebuild or what permits are required, and you can point to that, it's much easier to move forward. Next slide, please. So just some building code changes that we've made as a result of the disasters in the past. And we just made one to require in our wildfire zone 1, which is our plains area, our non-mountain area that we did not think was as much risk, to require ignition resistant construction now. So the whole county now requires ignition resistant construction as of earlier this month. So, next slide, please. And then also programmatic, we have the Wildfire Partners Program. And this is a grant funded program for the most part that the county runs, and it helps deal with the existing development. So a lot of what our tools are dealing with codes, and when we get new development proposals, and we have a lot of existing development out there, and this provides the ability to partner with the community and work to get mitigation to their homes. We've got about 2,000 some folks in this program now that have done the mitigation, they've got certified or getting certified. And again, as we look at the results from the Cold Spring fires and other fires, the homes that have gone through this have a better chance of surviving with less damage. So next slide, please. Just some more information on that program. And we are doing a pilot program. Next slide, please. A pilot program that we just released last month in the Plains area of the county now too, recognizing the hazard that's there, and a huge call from people. We've been getting a ton of calls to the program from the folks that live out on the plains of wanting to understand how they can mitigate their properties. And so there's definitely a need, and there's a demand and an interest in this. And so getting this done now is really important so that people can take action and help mitigate those impacts. Next slide, please. And I'll just briefly touch, you can go to the next slide too, on the state's Planning for Hazards guide. It's a great land use tool. It's a great website with all sorts of information, contacts, code studies, videos, things that you can use to kind of guide your planning process. And you can tailor to your jurisdictions what you need and what you want. And I think it's also great because it helps establish, again, those relationships and contacts with other folks. So you can pick up a phone and call anybody who's been through one of these events, and we can all share information, and you can kind of pick and choose your toolkit of what's going to work best for your jurisdiction and the model code language and so forth. Next slide. So my takeaways are, you got to pre-plan the disaster as much as you can, but you're going to get hit by something new and a question that you've never been asked, or a new rule or regulation that somebody didn't know about. So it's important and it helps, but you still should expect the unexpected. Always do engagement, always be out talking to the public. I think I touched on it earlier about training, keeping everybody up to date on where things stand. And when a disaster hits, be out listening to people. Don't assume you know what they need, because that's where you get into trouble and you get really angry citizens. Go out, listen to them. I tell my staff not to say no at all in the first meetings to folks. Like, let's listen, let's figure out what they need, and then let's talk about solutions and if they're there for these folks to move forward with. And so we learned that from the 2010 fire again too. I think we went out maybe too much in we know what you need to do, and we don't. We need to listen to what they need first, and then we can figure out what we need to do. And you just keep moving forward and learning and changing and adapting as you move forward. And it's really important to rest. We don't have enough resources when there's an event to do this. So it's hard to do. So next slide, and then I'll wrap it up here. And just why we have to keep doing it is because human nature says it's not going to be easy. People want to be out in nature. They want to be in these places. They want to build in some of these hazard zones. If you ever read the book, The Control of Nature, it's kind of all about that, is our sort of human nature of wanting to conquer nature in some ways. And So people are going to be there. We're going to have to figure out the best way for them to be there in many cases and figure out how to adapt and move forward. Next slide. And yeah, human nature, my GARP quote. So people also have short-term memories and don't think things are going to happen again or happen to them. And so that's why we have to be out there talking about it. I appreciate everybody being here listening to us today. Thanks.
Great, thank you so much, Dale. So with that, I'm going to go ahead and turn it over to McKenna to go through any of the questions that you all have. So we have about 10 minutes here to wrap up, but if you have any questions to ask any of the panelists, please go ahead and do so now. So McKenna, I will go ahead and turn it over to you.
Awesome, thank you so much. I'm going to stay off camera so you don't all have to watch me read my screen. So we'll just go ahead and get started here. First one is for Lori. Did you say that you pay OT in disasters to exempt employees, or did I mishear that? If you do, can you explain how that works a little bit?
Yes, we do. We have in our disaster policy 2 provisions. One is whenever anybody goes outside of the county, is deployed to somebody else's disaster, they will get paid overtime immediately as soon as they deploy. Obviously, after their 40 hours is up, overtime. And then the second provision is exempt employees will be paid overtime after 2 weeks of a local disaster declaration. The reason for that is because if it is a short duration event, a lot of our fires are, 3 to 5 days ish, then people have the time to rest up after that. But what we found in the 2013 flood is that people were burning out. The flood was so extensive and so much staff was working, 16-hour days with no days off. And so we found that instead of, burning out our employees and losing them, to allow for, if it's going to be a disaster that lasts more than 2 weeks, the overtime starts at that point. And our payroll process has been developed around that. So hopefully that answers your question.
Awesome, thank you so much. Next one asks, how can Colorado Emergency Preparedness Assessment and Resiliency Framework support counties to work together? And that's not directed to anyone in particular, so whoever feels they are best suited to answer.
Mike, do you want to go ahead and start with the assessment and then I can follow up?
Yeah, I can talk a little bit about how the assessment helps counties support each other. I think what we have seen counties do with that information is as they identify areas where they have gaps or think they are weak, they then begin to coordinate with their surrounding counties or neighbors for mutual aid agreements or other types of agreements that allow them to kind of bolster or pool their resources so that they can have a more robust response using resources outside their own jurisdiction. I think that's probably the principal way that the assessment can be used. It's just better you know yourself and you know your gaps, you can go to have meaningful conversations with your neighbors about where you can cooperate to fill those gaps. And what we find is in a lot of cases, neighbors have similar gaps, and so pooling their resources through mutual aid agreements is a good approach to making everybody a little bit stronger.
Great, thanks, Mike. And I'll say from the resiliency perspective, a couple of things. So first of all, resiliency is really looking at a holistic picture. So when we're thinking about resilience, we should be looking beyond just kind of our immediate jurisdiction. So there's a little bit of a balance there because obviously we need to look at the challenges that our own jurisdiction is facing, but oftentimes those aren't happening in a silo. Oftentimes a lot of the same types of challenges that we might be facing are also similar to those that our neighbors might be facing as well. And so doing things from a regional perspective can be really beneficial when it comes to your resiliency planning and talking through how resources might be able to be leveraged or how planning efforts can be supported across jurisdictional lines. Secondly, I will say that our resiliency framework also looks at cross-sector approaches. So not only just looking at different types of jurisdictions, but also looking at how community sectors interact with one another. So thinking about how efforts in the Department of Natural Resources also impacts planning for housing or for emergency management. And looking across those lines is really important to understand how those interactions are happening and how we can support one another best. And the last thing I'll mention is that at the Colorado Resiliency Office, we have a program that is being piloted as we speak that is known as the Roadmaps program. And that's really looking at a regional perspective when it comes to resiliency planning. And a lot of communities have been grouped together to talk through the challenges that they're facing and the priorities for their areas. And then the groups are working together as a cohesive unit to develop their own resiliency plans for their region. And so that's an effort that is going on right now, and we continue to plan to do similar types of efforts moving forward as an office to encourage that cross-jurisdictional collaboration. So I hope that helps answer the question as well.
Wonderful, thank you. It looks like we might have time for one more. Can you speak a little bit more to the role and responsibility of electeds to be prepared for disasters, or what you've seen in the past? And that's to the group again. That's kind of to anyone who wants to answer.
I can take a stab at that really quick. So the role of the elected really is to be available for those policy decisions to ensure that before the disaster, they've really looked through what are the requirements that are needed as far as agreements, as far as contracts, any of that needs to be established pre-disaster, and working with the emergency manager. But during the disaster, they really need to be available to the emergency management agency and to the partners to answer those key questions about any ordinance changes, any resolutions that might be needed, questions that are specific to policy or specific to budget that cannot really be made by an employee of the city or the county. So that would be my number one thing, is to be available. We do conference calls at least once a day during a disaster where I talk with our policy group, which is what we call that, and that is our elected officials, our legal counsel, and any of the directors that have a direct impact on what's going on within that disaster. So COVID would have been the public health director, and fire would be the sheriff. So in those cases, we would just walk through with them what we're currently seeing, what are the questions that we need answered, and then if they need to go to a board meeting to change anything, they know that they need to do that.
Yeah, and I can add something a little bit to that too. I think very similarly, our county commissioners get very involved, and it's great, and out talking to the community and being the face for the community, and that really helps folks. And then as part of that preparation before the disaster, again, is understanding regulations and limitations before you're out there talking to folks, because it's natural. Any of us, we want to help these folks get back as quickly as we can, and they have what seem like really reasonable requests. But if it's a floodplain issue or something like that, there's going to be requirements that they're going to have to meet. So having the electeds really understand that framework and understand that it might take a little more effort than a simple yes to get somebody to where they need to be is really important. So work with your staffs to kind of understand those regulations ahead of time, and then be out in the community and listening and being the ears and talking to your staff then about what are solutions is really important.
And Dale brings up a really good point about managing expectations. So a big part of my job is trying to manage the expectations of the community. And I give talking points to our electeds for that. But when they're talking to people, they shouldn't say, money's going to come right away, we're going to do this, we're going to do that, because then when it doesn't happen, they get really disgruntled with the disaster. So really trying to manage what that expectation is and what's coming their way to help with recovery.
Wonderful. Thank you all so much. I think that was great. I learned a ton. I know everyone else did as well. It looks like that's all the time that we have for questions today, and I will direct any follow-ups to you as well as they come through. So just a reminder for everybody, I will be sending a recording link and the materials from this webinar along later this week, so you will have access to those. And please feel free to send any questions my way, and I can put you in contact with the right person or make sure you get those resources. Also, just want to remind you that we do have part 2 coming up on June 15th, so make sure you register for that as well. We really appreciate all of our speakers' time. Thank you so much for being here, and thank you for giving the time to talk about this really important issue. And thank you to everyone who attended today. And also thank you to our partners. We really appreciate everyone's time. And I hope you have a wonderful rest of your afternoon. Have a good one.
Thank you, McKenna. Thank you, everyone.
Thanks.